of Persian literature and Persian studies in the United States, and I consider to be a good friend of mine. Dr. Hakkak is a professor and founding director of the Center for Persian Studies at the University of Maryland here in College Park. For 19 years, he was a professor of Persian language and literature and Iranian culture and civilization at the University of Washington. He has studied in Iran and the United States, receiving his PhD in comparative literature from Rutgers University in 1979. He has taught English, comparative literature and translation studies, as well as classical and modern Persian literature at the University of Tehran, Rutgers University, Columbia University, and the University of Texas as well. Professor Karimi-Hakkak is the author of 19 books and over 100 major scholarly articles. His works have been translated into French, Dutch, Spanish, Russian, Greek, Arabic, Japanese, and Persian. Without further ado, Dr. Karimi-Hakkak, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I don't think we need a microphone, do we?
No, but they use it for the recording.
Oh, for the recording. Okay, fine. It's a delight to be here. Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank Ms. Laura Riley and my good friend, Mr. Babak Houqi, who is really, both of them are doing colossal work getting you people here. As far as I'm concerned, you know, this is among colleagues in the education enterprise, and I think I'm very happy about this format. I don't like as much when I have to stand up at the podium and address, pontificate, and issue preachments and such. I've been given an hour, now 50 minutes probably, and I'll try not to speak more than 30-35 minutes, because I know, and this always happens even when I teach freshman students, let alone colleagues, when I talk to them, I end up learning more than they do probably, and it's a wonderful delight of the education world that this is true. The task I've been given is really daunting, to talk about Persian literature, all 1100 years of it, in 40-50 minutes. Obviously, it had to be narrowed down somehow, and because of the centrality of poetry, I have selected poetry. But of course, you know, the themes, the concerns, the even systemic features of Persian prose literature are not that different from Persian poetry. And of course, poetry is what Iranians are known for. You know, it's a culture that has poetry right at the center of everything. In fact, one question I always take to my students at the beginning: why is poetry so marginal in America? What happened? By what process did that happen? Because of course, you know, I know that why it happened, and I know, and I'm glad, and I hope. In fact, I secretly hope, although it's one of those wishes that you can't share with too many people, that poetry would eventually find its smaller but more well-defined niche in the entire configuration of culture. So I think the fact that poetry is so central means that certain disciplines, for example, have yet to emerge in Persian-speaking world, and I dare say by extension in the Arabic world and various other non-Western traditions. And the development of logical thinking, non-metaphorical, based on reasoning, etc., may have been hampered because of the dominance of poetry as a mode of expression. But of course, you know, aesthetically, it's a very, very rich tradition. You know, of course, of a man called Rumi, lived 800 years ago, and his work has now taken this country by storm, tremendously famous. So I'll just try walking you through the most important stages and turning points and watershed figures in this tradition, leaving it to the discussion to fill in the blanks. Before that, I'm peddling some wares here, and I would ask you as your colleague to please take these to your school districts and your students. We are looking for a few good men and women to do Persian studies. For the first time in history, the University of Maryland has established Persian studies defined not as the studies of the modern country of Iran only, but as still an international culture. Persian language itself is an international language. It's spoken in Iran, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and a few other places in Central Asia, as well as among the sizable and growing diaspora communities, of which we have representatives here, I understand. And so it is one of those emerging fields that will continue to grow whether diplomatic relations are established or not, whether this or that president resigns or gets elected or not, or whatever. And culture does its own work. Remember, this community is now enriched by over 1 million second-generation people, typically our children, who are entering the culture as Iranian Americans, claiming their niche in this culture. And I think their lives, their adventures as part of American history will have to be studied as well. And so I think it is very important to pay attention to this culture area, and I'm very thrilled that the University of Maryland is doing that. More and more the burden of such universality is being placed not on big-name universities, but on state universities that are responsive to their taxpayers, their citizens. Our children are demanding that their language be taught, that their culture be paid attention, that their history be studied in various universities. And I see a very good future for the greater expansion of American education into these fields. And God knows we need that expansion. You know better than I do how parochial education has traditionally been here in this culture. We still get, jokes about, things that you can turn into jokes about the typical American understanding of the world, the innocence abroad kind of syndrome, where really, you go to Mexico and you say that the damn waiter doesn't even speak English, or saying if English was good enough for Jesus Christ, it's got to be good enough for us as well. This was actually said on the floor of the Louisiana legislature in 1943, when the state, because of its French-speaking background, was trying to write into its budget a translation of the Old Testament into French. And then one representative of the people of Louisiana gets up and says, if English was good enough for Jesus Christ, it's got to be good enough for us. So those are the kinds of challenges we're facing. Now, back to my topic of Persian literature. I'm giving you a 2-page handout. I don't think we'll have the time to read all of them, but I just want to let you know that one of the basic contentions of this is that as a literary tradition, as an aesthetic tradition, Persian is very, very much worth studying, because it's a continuous tradition that illustrates some of the systemic as well as contextual features of the growth of literature. The growth of literature can be observed in the Persian tradition far better than, for example, in the English tradition, which is just as rich, but of course it's got ruptures. Continuity seems to have been the catchword and the ultimate thing that people, poets and readers and patrons, have strived for in the Persian tradition. So we see in this tradition, if we get to study it, a way of understanding the movement of literature, the movement of aesthetic expressions through time. And of course, contextually, it's very important because it is the thing that gave Iranians their distinct and distinguishable identity within the Islamic Brotherhood, within the Islamic fraternity of nations. Remember, as Islam crossed Tigris and Euphrates and came into the Iranian plateau as well as into the Eastern Roman Empire, it was not, and this is a mistake a lot of people make. They think Islam came to these lands ready-made. Islam was only a book of scattered verses plus a few traditions, stories related to the life of Muhammad. It was in intermingling with the already existing Zoroastrianism of the Iranian plateau, Buddhism of Central Asia, all the other languages of the Indus Valley, the early Christianity in the Roman Empire, that it got to be the universal religion that we know. Everything is dialogic. That at least is my belief. And so nothing develops in toto, nothing develops in solitude, nothing develops through soliloquy. religions, of course, and of course this is a view of someone who looks at religions historically. Religions too have their own histories, and they have their own interactions with other religious traditions. In spite of their claims, they take, they assimilate, they give, and they mix and mingle with a lot of traditions. This is what happened in the Iranian plateau. And by the Iranian plateau, I mean basically Western Asia, plus central portions of Central Asia, and of course all the way to the Indus Valley. Now, because Iranians felt like this new religion, appealing as it was not homegrown. They had their own ambivalent attitude towards it. They still do. Therefore, one of the distinctions I try to argue for with my colleagues is the distinction between Arab Islam and non-Arab Islam. And this is not to say one is better than the other, but it has manifestations in various things. For Arabs, Islam is their nationalism. For Iranians and Turks and many others, it is a separate structure which challenges their nationalism. Sometimes they reconcile it, sometimes they don't. In modern times, they have not been able to recognize it. Look at what's happening in Turkey. They're having a terribly uneasy relationship with Islam ever since the time of the Young Turks and Ataturk and all the rest of it. Iran has always opted for half-baked solutions, and we'll get to that, I suppose. But back to poetry, this poetry grew up in the courts of Central Asia, Bukhara and Samarkand, today in the Republic of Uzbekistan, Marv, a city in modern Turkmenistan, Herat, and Balkh in Afghanistan today. Balkh, of course, does not exist. The city of Mazar Sharif is next to it, and Herat, but Herat does exist. In Ghazni, which is south of Kabul, in Kandahar, and all the rest of it. So this tradition grew up in courts. In fact, the word for this language, Persian that we speak, in the native Afghani tradition, Afghani variant of Persian, is Dari, which means the language of the courts. And it grew up under the patronage of kings. And so it was a very elitist kind of expression. Harking back to its Zoroastrian roots, it was very, very worldly. And it expressed this worldliness through concrete images. And I've got an example for you in my first example. Look at that. Live joyfully with black-eyed beauties. Live joyfully. The world is no more than legends in the wind. Thinking of the future, you should rejoice, and for the past, you ought to have no care. And so on and so forth. So, as you see, black-eyed beauties, the things of this world, feasting, fighting, all the things that place a person in the context of society, give it his or her personal identity, but at the same time forces one to interact with culture, those entities that are larger than himself. It's a very simple mode of expression, early Persian poetry is. Look at that. Live joyfully with black-eyed beauties. But the features, the systemic features of Persian poetry are already visible. Black-eyed beauties becomes a code word. So those of you with blue eyes, you can go home. Black-eyed beauties, and those, in other words, it's a system that works through ideal types. A little known fact is that by this time, the Persians and the Byzantines and everybody knew their Plato. They knew their Aristotle. And so they were working through the ideals, the Platonic ideal types. And so when I call my beloved a moon-faced beauty, that does not mean her face is round or pale like a moon or anything. It just means it's perfect. Black-eyed beauties becomes a way of expressing the beauty that cannot be surpassed. So it works through these ideal expressions that bring to mind, associate in our minds with the best of everything, which is why I call this basic systemic mode of operation of this poetry idealization. It has little room for reality. Reality is there to be idealized, not so much to be realized. This is the state of Persian poetry: elitist, simple in language, and expressed through ideal types for at least 2-3 centuries. Call it centuries 10th through the 12th. Now, at this time, of course, more and more Iranians are converting to Islam, either by force or by the force of their own convictions, and they want a sort of reconciliation or modus vivendi develops between Persian poetry. They've also beaten back the Arabic dominance that the overlords, Arab overlords, wanted to annihilate the language of Persia in the same way that they annihilate the language of Egypt or Syria or the Levant, etc., etc. The Persians resisted through their poetry. And it became an aesthetic system identified forever with Persian, Iranian, in the larger sense, identity. So, in the 12th century, the challenge becomes something else. Islam, like so many other Abrahamic religions, like Christianity and Judaism, for example, has two faces. It's got an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth face, and it's got a beautiful, compassionate face where God himself takes delight in forgiving human sins. And so these two seemingly irreconcilable aspects are reconciled in what is known as Islamic mysticism, otherwise known as Sufism, S-U-F-I-S-M. Sufism is the Islamic mystic tradition. And again, like so much else in society, it develops dialogically. It is instructive to know that some of the oldest extant texts of the Persian language were written in Bukhara and Samarkand, those Central Asian Persian-speaking countries, and were written in the old Hebraic script, not in the modern Perso-Arabic script, but in the Hebraic, in the Hebrew script, which means, and has raised theory, although other people are challenging it, that there must have been constant give and take between Jewish rabbis in Central Asia at that time and the newly Muslim commentators, which has given them the same method of midrashim as applied to the Quran, the text of the Quran and the prophetic traditions, expanding it, making it mellow and more moderate and more humane, and giving Islam a far tenderer face than it had originally, militaristic, when Muhammad was bent on expanding, and of course his successors, the guiding caliphs, etc., etc. In the 12th century, something interesting happens. Into the equation of Persian poetry, which features primarily the poet and the patron, and the poet as lover and his beloved, and this is of his, of course, there's no her there because it's an entirely masculine tradition, enters a third element, and that is God. In Islamic orthodoxy, the emotion that organizes humans in relation to their God is fear. We still say God-fearing Muslims, God-fearing Christians, right? How about God-loving Muslims and God-loving Christians? What if you imagined your God as your beloved? After all, God is beautiful, isn't he? Allah Jamil wa yuhibb al-jamal in Arabic, in the words of the Quran. God is beautiful and loves beauty. And so aesthetics develops on the assumption of God's eternal, perfect beauty. And your beloved's beauty becomes a pale reflection of that divine beauty. You can imagine how that changes. You don't just do good in exchange to go to heaven. You do good because good is beautiful. It would take John Keats centuries to express that. Truth is beauty, beauty is truth, and so on and so forth. And so it is a tremendous force in favor of giving rise to a new discourse with love at its very center. When you make love to your beloved, you are really worshiping God. You're really replicating the original act of creation. Procreating is a sort of creation. Anyway, so all of that happens. Enter God and this whole beautiful mystic imaginary. There are verses in the Quran that lend themselves to endless interpretation. One of them is such. In the Quran we read, when God created the mold of the human spirit, undistinguished, unindividuated, it addressed, in what language we know not, it addressed that collective mold of humanity and said, am I not your Lord? Alastu bi rabbikum? They said yes. And that is an existential relationship, not a conditional relationship. Also, when Adam and Eve commit their transgression, according to the text of the Quran, they're totally forgiven. So there's no original sin in Islam, such as Christians feel upon their shoulders. So all of this gives rise to a God-centered religious discourse expressed in poetry that sets individuals on a quest for their source of their being. You see this in poets like Sanai. You see this in poets like Attar, and I really highly recommend to you as colleagues Dick Davis and Afkham Darbandi's translation of The Conference of the Birds. It's a Penguin classic, 1983. It's a wonderful book, A Conference of the Birds. It's a parable. It's an allegory of the birds seeking the phoenix, the Seymour, which is the Persian equivalent of the phoenix, and it turns out to be God. And of course, in the quest, giving meaning to their own lives, and a lot of them fall because their wings are weak, etc., etc. But those that make it eventually see themselves looking down on a tarn, a body of water on top of a mountain, mirror-like. They see their own image. There are 30 birds at this point, and Seymour in Persian means 30 birds. So they see their own reflection. Everything is internalized. That's why the first major systemic shift in Persian poetry, and I call it the grand internalization. That's why what gives rise to mystical poetry, exemplified in my little handout in 3 poems, one by Sanai, and 2 by Rumi. Let me just read a couple of lines of the Rumi ones for you. Listen to the story told by the reed of being separated. Since I was cut from the reed bed, I have made this crying sound. Anybody apart from someone he loves understands what I say. Anyone pulled from a source longs to go back. This is important. We have all been pulled from a source. Our growth stunted. We need to find our way back to that source. I was reading some years ago Bill Clinton's memoir, and towards the end he speaks about this tradition among American blacks of homegoing, talking about death as homegoing. You're really going home. And that's exactly how it is in the Islamic mystical tradition. It's a wonderful image that we are all exiles in this world. This world is a place of exile, which annihilates the distinction between me, an immigrant, and you, daughters of the American Revolution, as you might be. So it is a way of generalizing the state of exile in the way that 21st century seems to be bringing into fruition. Because in the 21st century, no one dies where they were born. Everybody moves, right? We are all on the move. So that mystical tradition catapults Persian poetic idiom systemically into a different dimension. Integrates the world. It makes it universal. It makes it unitarian, if you will. It makes it ecumenical. It makes it not sectarian so much. You know, when September 11 happened, I gave a talk at my home institution, University of Washington at that time, called Bin Laden and Rumi. And in fact, both tendencies can arise from within Islam. In the same way that Hitler and Nelson Mandela or Gandhi, or not Gandhi, can rise from other traditions. So there's no sense in tying people to their religious roots. There's a lot of Christian violence in history, as you well know. And so there's no way to shun that or to make generalizations, and this is not because I'm trying to be nice or I'm liberal or anything. It's a fact of life. Only those people blind to history would posit one religion as superior to the other. It's all part of the same pool of activities. Anyway, systemically, this tradition makes Persian poetry very, very complex and sophisticated, hair-splitting, far-fetched conceits, so that it is very difficult to understand, for example, the Masnavi, Rumi's magnum opus, of the mystical quest, without commentary. The language is there, but the culture behind the language is not accessible, much like reading Shakespeare today in America. The context would need to be explained. The words need to be explained at times, their meanings, everything has changed. This is the situation in Persian poetry. It grows little by little. over 400 years from the 9th to the 14th century. The Mongol and Tartar invasions of Persia, and the larger Persia, I mean, including modern-day Afghanistan, Central Asia, and modern Iran, all the way into Anatolia, devastates that culture. It's a devastating thing. Two things: Mongols in 1220, and Tartars in 1380, 1370s, 1380s, lay the land to waste. Large cities like Balkh is destroyed, Herat is destroyed, Neyshabur is destroyed, and various other culture centers. You know, in the old world we did not have countries, we had cities. Cities were centers of cultural activity. There were centers and peripheries. And so these boundaries have kind of stunted our feelings of how connected we all are, because it's mine up to this point and yours from that point on, which is not facts and life. Every time I've crossed the border, I've realized how silly and how artificial, how superficial these political boundaries are. But of course, on the maps hanging in your classrooms, they're all very bold, and you can ask your student to point to this or that country, which really gives a very, very distorted view of how the world works. I'm longing for the time, and this is not a trope, it really is my wish, where those borders are paled to the way that only mean there's a political division. This is a new political entity governs this territory. Every time someone goes to Iran, for example, you know, these difficult days in Iran, and they come back, they tell you, gosh, the people are nice. And it's not nice because they're endemically nice or other people are mean. That's because you've passed through the political thing. You've met the Islamic Republic of Iran at the airport, and they've stamped your passport, and that's it. The rest, you're within a pool of human beings, just like yourselves. So I'm not making any nationalistic or chauvinistic statements. I'm just referring to those facts that tend to be less visible to us because of the way we conceptualize the world. And of course, one other very terrible way of conceptualizing the world, especially in America, is this regional thing. For the past 60 years, the Middle East has been Arabicized and politicized. We do not see people living their lives. We see people killing one another or bombing one another. Nor do we see the distinction between Arab and non-Arab. Not that one is inferior, but they are different. The Turks have their own challenges. The Iranians have their own challenges. In fact, only 20% of Muslims are Arabs. And yet, Arab nationalism has led to innocent expressions such as Arab and Muslim world. It's like saying America and Europe or America and Japan, which is fine if we want to talk about large chunks of the world. But of course, that tends to annihilate the distinctions as we cross borders, as we get to see different peoples in terms of their own histories. Anyway, early 16th century, the first of the Safavid Dynasty kings, Shah Ismail, again establishes a state, a country called Iran. That country, Safavids? Please ask your question. 16th century, 1501 in fact. The first year of the 16th century. Ismail, I or E, it's translated differently, E-S-M-A-I-L, and he was the founder of the Safavid Dynasty, S-A-F-A-V-I-D. Safavid Dynasty that lasted well into the 18th century and was the first dynasty to encounter Europe. Not in a systemic way, but still, you know, visitors from Europe came to Isfahan. This is the greatest of the Safavids was Abbas, who at the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th, made Isfahan. And Isfahan, of course, was a marvel of the world, and a lot of Venetian merchants talk about the beauties of Isfahan. Isfahan, to this day, is a jewel of world culture. The Safavids saw themselves faced with two powerful enemies, to their northeast and to their northwest. To their northeast were the Turkic tribes of Chagatai, now known as the Uzbeks. To the northwest, the newly established and far stronger dynasty called the Ottomans. They were both Sunni Muslims. So as a matter of political expediency, they declared Shiism the official religion of the country in order to mobilize the Shia sentiments against Sunnis. So that in the wars between Iranians and the Uzbeks and the Ottomans, the mullahs would climb the pulpits and they would say, you are the sons and daughters of Ali and Fatima, the rightful successors of Muhammad, and these guys are the sons of their enemies. So it was there deliberately to mobilize animosity. And it did. It preserved a country called the modern country of Iran, which through the centuries became more and more truncated, but nonetheless still exists as a political entity. On the negative side, it isolated Iran, a Shiite enclave, a Shiite island in a sea of Sunni Islam, and it sowed the seed of constant and abiding and perennial animosity and enmity between Shias and Muslims, which to this day we suffer, although the projects of modernity and other projects in all countries have kind of mellowed that, so that today not every Sunni wants to kill every Shia, but some Sunnis want to kill some Shias and the other way around. And so there's schism in Islam. Now, gradually, of course, the projects of colonialism, since the Renaissance, the 18th century, and so on and so forth, come to the Persian-speaking world as well as other cultures. The West gets introduced, not through its poetry, not through its analytic thinking, not through its power of reasoning, but through the power of gunpowder, big ships. And imagine yourself being a Muslim standing on the shores of India, for example, or the Persian Gulf, seeing these big ships. You ask yourself a question. You believe in your heart that Islam, your religion, is superior to all the other religions because it was God's last revelation. But then you see that you have been rendered powerless. What happened? One of two answers emerge. Number one is, we were mistaken. Islam never was the best of all religions. This kind of answering process through history gives rise to secularism, secularization of society. So religion becomes a set of relations that connects you as individual to your God, and all religions are about the same, etc., etc. The same thing that in the West gave rise to Masonic lodges and so on. So that's one set of answers. The other one is no. Islam continues to remain, in essence, the best of all religions. We deserted it. It was degenerated. It went corrupt. And so it was deformed. And anything that's deformed, you can start to reform. So, reformism. How do you reform something? You go back to the foundational texts. You go back to the fundaments. So the basic flaw in calling people like Khomeini fundamentalist is that he is fundamentalist without being fanatical. He is a reformist, in fact. And he, in his lifetime, and throughout the 20th century, other grand ayatollahs have had their own enemies on the right, if you will. People who still think that traveling by car is not sanctioned. You have to go to Mecca on the camel, on the back of a camel, because that's how the Prophet Muhammad went to Mecca. So the moment when Khomeini emerged in Tehran out of that Air France airplane in 1978, many of you may not remember, but those of you who do, with his hand on the hands of the Air France pilot, a Christian, he made a very, very important progressive statement. Christians are not unclean. It's all right to touch their hands. That was the basic idea. The Christians are unclean, and so are the Jews, and so is everyone else. Only Muslims are clean. Muslims have to avoid contact, touch with non-Muslims. So all of that is to say, and I have to suffice at these little examples, to say that we need to understand cultures on their own terms. Back to Persian poetry, I always make a distinction for my students between modernization and Westernization. In the West, that distinction does not hold because for you, modern was native, right? But imagine the modern, for example, modern medicine, clearly superior to this Abyssinian medicine, clearly superior to medieval medicine. Imagine that going into those cultures in the 18th and 19th centuries. A different theory of medicine, the germ theory of medicine, etc. Not the theory of the four elements and the four humors, and one is phlegmatic, the other is sanguine, and a third one is bileful, etc., etc. Right? Because it is science, it's accepted. But it goes with the culture. And that culture says, and because of patriarchy, of course, most physicians are men. And I, as a good practicing Muslim, I'm not, I'm just joking, but I, as a good practicing Muslim in the 19th century, don't want my wife, my mother, my daughter to be examined by a male stranger. What do we do? The Islamic Republic's answer to that is, let's train female gynecologists. And they've done that. So, and I'm not saying that's good or anything. I'm just saying modernization is different from Westernization. A lot of Americans think that the Shah was a modernizer. And this is the man who destroyed political parties in Iran. How can you be modern and move a basically constitutional country with a democratic government and establish your own dictatorship? But because political parties are less visible than high-rises or mini-skirts or Scotch whiskey, it can't be seen. People thought that Westernization was modernization. Ataturk was caught in that fallacy. He changed the alphabet of the Ottoman language to make it European. Irony of ironies. Greece, the cradle of Western civilization, has never had a Latin alphabet. And still it's the cradle of Western civilization. And the Ottomans, having changed their alphabet in 1922, in the 80-some years that they have done so, only 18% of the Ottoman books have been transliterated into the new script. That's an example of Westernization. So unless the dichotomy and the difference between Westernization and modernization is understood, and understood well, and understood from within, as one, of course everyone wants to be modern. Who does not want modern amenities and comforts of life? You should have to be irrational not to want that. But that kind of coming along with the time that would not produce identity crisis in your head. This is not me anymore. My daughter is dressing like the American beauties. The same thing that in the 1950s and 60s encouraged American blacks to develop their own dolls. It was a travesty that their children had to play with Barbies, or use Band-Aids that had only color pink. A similar thing, magnified culturally many times, is happening in the world today. Americanization is being sold in the name of globalization. McDonald being its identifying sign. Back to the poetry. Of course, poetry was modernized. By and large, poetry shifted from a system of idealization, ideal types that I mentioned, into what I call a process of realization, making things real. Genres began to develop. There was no novel. There was no short stories. There were hikayas, which means tales, and exemplar, and so on and so forth. There are in every culture. Such as, for example, Hesiod and Aesop and various other old-time classical fable makers. But the modern short story, the novel, modern poetry, realistic poetry anchored in social life, in systemic terms, it grew to be very, very easy. It left its systemic things in the 19th and 20th century, and today a process of integrating Arabic and Persian literature into the texture of world literature is well underway. Very few Americans connect with Goethe's ideal of Weltliteratur. Basically, he said literature is its own language. It's true that it's expressed in different languages, natural languages such as Russian, English, Persian, Chinese, etc. But aesthetics is a language in itself. It's based on comparison, it's based on similes and metaphors and so on and so forth, or in the language of semiotics, and I'm one, signs, signifiers and signifieds, etc., etc. So there was a tremendous expansion, systemic expansion of Persian poetry, which came about as a result of a century of translation movement. Translation movements are wonderful to study. In fact, Mistranslations are great things to study. Untranslatability is a wonderful thing to study. I have been ensconced in this culture for 40 years, and still when an American friend tells me, this is my cousin, I don't really know who the person is. Because even if I see her, for example, let's suppose it's a woman, that connotes 4 different relations, right? Is she the daughter of my mother's sister, or is she the daughter of my father's sister? And is she the daughter of, all of those things, as you can imagine. The daughter of my mother's brother, the daughter of my father's brother. Languages are wonderful things through which to teach cultural diversity. The trouble is, we don't even study languages in this country. So, once again, Persian literature has joined the stream of world literature. It's giving and taking. Witness the successful translations that people like Coleman Barks have made of Rumi, and Dick Davis is making of the Shahnameh, of which I have not spoken. Those things are important developments, and we need to learn those. There are all manners of styles, generic expansion and enlargement of all the genres, from lyrics to all that. For example, the last poem I have, and this will have to be my last example, is by a woman who lived only for 32 years. She's often compared to Sylvia Plath, the American poet. I'm naked, 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 naked as the hushed stillness between words of love, and my scars are all from loving, loving, loving. I have steered this island of agony over the ocean's uproar, above volcanic violence, and falling apart was at the heart of that wholeness being whose least atoms gave birth to sun. It's almost indistinguishable from an American expression. We are finding finally a language of world literature. And so I think this makes this poetry tremendously accessible to your students. Fortunately, books of scholarship, and in fact high school books are being written on that too. Let me recommend one to you. The 6th volume of a series called World Literature and Its Time is titled Middle Eastern Literatures and Their Times. And I have contributed to that as well. And it just highlights, in a very elementary way, good for your students, the highlights of Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Hebrew literatures, Middle Eastern literatures and their times. And so there are works like that, and I think as educators, we really ought to bring world literature into our classes through which to teach people, various peoples, various histories, and various tradition. And I thank you very much for your attention.
With that, if there are any questions, I'm sure Dr. Karimi-Hakkak.
I would love to, yes.
Talk a little bit about, I think that's some of the issue that we all have, whereas people judge the Muslim world, because they really don't seem to be a difference between being Arab and being Muslim.
Yeah, that's
You
true.
would give advice to, I'm Muslim personally, I understand really what's happening. If you give advice to, or even suggestion to my colleagues trying to help students unravel that part,
Yeah.
a lot of time when you're talking about Islam or terrorism, they would think of Arab when they think of more Muslim.
Yeah, yeah.
And even with all some of the laws now with some of these bills where they can wiretap people because of the name, there's several people that's like, I might be named El Hajj, they might wiretap me just because of the name El Hajj, which has nothing to do with me, being into terrorism. So what kind of suggestion or approach would you give to my colleagues maybe to help students kind of learn that part? Because it's extremely difficult, for them.
A very important question. I'm sure there are ideas around the table as well. But I'm a big fan of teaching the unfamiliar in terms of the familiar. Refer them back to Christianity, to the Inquisition, if you will, to Salem witch hunts, to Hitler, who in the name of Christianity, and we know very little of that, did a lot of the horror things that he did. And so, again, once you bring it home in that sense, they may get to understand the diversity within those things. You know, in my classes, I begin with this thing. The world, the phenomenal world out there is far more complex than any language. Languages, as complex as they are based on dichotomies. And so you've got, when you say Christian and Muslim, it's like you're already establishing a dichotomy, or man-woman, or black-white, right? However, the world out there is full of shades of difference. I argue with my students. I say, in the world out there, in the pre-linguistic world, there is no night and day. They're both chunks of time, or continuities of time. We know that in a period of 24 hours, we have a constant diminishing and enhancement of light by turns. Night and day are in the world of language. So Muslim and Christian and Jew and pagan and atheist and agnostic are terms by which we are caught in the Aristotelian trap of categorizing and classifying the world. If we have to, we will use them as terms of convenience. But at the same time, we draw our students' attentions to the insufficiency of such naming. And so the best thing I know is, well, let's divide the class and each one of you take a Muslim country, for example, and let's talk about that Muslim country. And let's choose one country and talk about that country in terms of its religious diversity. It's interesting that Iran is one of the most diverse, religiously, one of the most diverse countries in the world. And that's why when this crazy man, Mr. Ahmadinejad, started giving his rants about the Holocaust, etc., the best response, I thought, was to have a conference called Iranian Jewry, from past to present. It's a world-class conference, and I invite you all to that conference if you wish to come. That's what we do as educators. We educate. We don't propagandize. We don't proselytize. We just look at history from past to present. Muslim, Jew, Christian. It's on pages 12 and 13 of the newsletter you have. And so I invite you all to that conference, and really I think it would be great to talk about it. I think the book that will come out of it will shed light on what? 27 centuries of Jewish presence in Iran. 27 centuries, 2,700 years. Before Achaemenids, 2,500, Cyrus the Great, of whom Iranians are proud. Before anything else. And the Jews are still there. And I invite you to watch a clip, a 6-7 minute clip on your YouTube called The Jews of Isfahan. You see they go to their synagogues. Does that mean Iran as a whole country, including the state, is the ideal place? Far from it. Of course not. But people live their lives. They have their neighbors and friends. And it's the Muslim who intercedes on behalf of the Jews to an unjust state such as we have in Iran today. So it's all of these things. Another fact, when Americans speak about countries, they say, have you, yeah, I'm sure you've heard, the Iranians. And by that, who do they mean? Khamenei, Ahmadinejad, and a bunch of other blokes. They don't mean us. They don't mean even the toiling masses of Iran. And for the life of me, I don't understand why one other word cannot be added. The Iranian government, the Iranian state. State, society, and culture are different entities. And if we don't teach this fact to our students, we have really diminished their ability for critical reading. So I think in all kinds of tactics and strategies, we can help them understand the complexities that cannot be captured in sound bites and such. Please.
Back to literature. How much of current and past Persian literature would be celebrated in today's Iran, and how much would be censored? Do they censor any of the literature?
Well, as you well know, censorship exists everywhere. Everywhere. Sometimes it's sexual. It's more in this country, for example. Sometimes it's political. There's no absolutely free country, and Iran is one of the least free countries today. But all that does, it complicates the game of cat and mouse that authors play with authorities, and it makes you think of clever ways of saying what you want to say. Censorship is, I've written on censorship extensively, and censorship is like a running water. It finds its way to the sea because it's destined to the sea of expression. And so governments, the Roman Empire tried for 400 years to censor the New Testament. Couldn't. But does it affect? Does it stunt the growth of literature? Of course it does. I wish it did not. But censorship is, again, you begin with the universality of the thing. Censorship is not what they have and we don't, because we're censoring. You are censoring yourselves in your classroom every minute of the time, aren't you? And so am I. And so discourses are limited, are constrained by the situation. They're situationally constrained, they're politically constrained, they're sexually constrained in terms of, all kinds of ways of managing your discourse. But one of the things that happens is I become the custodian of so many beautiful poems, and I'm asked to keep it in my custody until the poet is dead. That's one of the things that happens, for example. A lot of samizdat, what the Russians used to call samizdat, underground literature, a lot of it.
Well, if there are no other questions, I wish to thank you, Dr.
My
Karimi-Hakkak.
pleasure.
It was a fantastic talk, covered not just literature, but Persian history.
Thank you so much.
Which we don't otherwise have as a subject, and also religion. We were hoping that Vali and Nasr would be able to speak about the religions of Iran. Unfortunately, he's
It would have
traveling,
been wonderful.
but I think you filled in for him, and
Thank
for a
you.
historian, and of course covered literature. So we truly appreciate your time and your speaking.
Thank you for your invitation. Thank you, Mr.
Visibly.
Thank you.